Hello, this is Bill Bullard with R-CALF USA, the voice of the independent cattle producer in the United States of America. Well, since December 2015, when Congress repealed mandatory country of origin labeling, or COOL, for beef, R-CALF USA has been fighting to bring it back. Back then, calf prices were about $200. After COOL's repeal, calf prices fell $61, and today, 4 years later, calf prices are only marginally above the low they hit in 2016. What Congress took from America's cattle producers was the only tool to enable them to compete in their own domestic market. America produces the safest, most wholesome beef in the world, but Congress deprived the entire U.S. cattle industry of the means to offer that superior beef to consumers. Instead, importers bring in billions of pounds of cheaper, undifferentiated beef and cattle that cannot be distinguished from the higher quality and safer U.S. beef. Only an origin label can do that. And importers certainly aren't going to voluntarily label beef with a COOL label because their shareholders are earning huge profits by making consumers believe all the beef in a grocery store is USDA inspected and therefore USA produced. For several years, no one in Congress cared that the U.S. cattle producers were being forced to compete in the marketplace with their hands tied behind their backs. Instead, Congress appeared to worship the international tribunal known as the World Trade Organization, and that's who told Congress to repeal COOL. I don't think that old threat would fly under our new administration. Nevertheless, there we were trying to find a champion willing to stand up for the American cattle producer. Back in March, we met with Montana Senator Jon Tester's staff, and they agreed to start congressional consideration for restoring country of origin labeling for beef. Senator Tester decided to start the process with a resolution that would cause the entire U.S. Senate to revisit the COOL issue. His first draft early last spring called for tweaking voluntary COOL by establishing that a USA label would be reserved only for animals born, raised, and slaughtered in the U.S. Now that sounds a lot like COOL, doesn't it? Not at all. That tweak to voluntary labels gives importers and packers complete discretion as to whether or not to label anything. We told the senator we would rather he did nothing than to pave the way for simply tweaking a voluntary COOL program. We told him when U.S. cattle producers sell their calves, they need absolute assurance that the meat from their cattle would be labeled born, raised, and slaughtered in the USA when it was sold in a U.S. grocery store. Mandatory COOL is the only way to provide that needed assurance, and Senator Tester agreed. It took several months to complete the resolution as several other groups were involved in the process of approving the actual language. Senator Tester wanted a consensus, and we tried to get several more U.S. senators to co-sponsor the resolution, including South Dakota Senator John Thune. They all declined. So on October 31st, only 1 out of 535 members of Congress stepped to the plate to restore the competitiveness of America's cattle producers. Senator Tester's resolution states, resolved, that the Senate supports legislation to reinstate country of origin labeling for pork and beef to allow consumers to make an informed and free choice about where their food comes from. This opens the door to bring back mandatory COOL for beef. This is exactly what we need. Unfortunately, other groups were at work to undermine Senator Tester's efforts by distracting attention away from the need to reinstate COOL. They convinced South Dakota Senator John Thune and Mike Rounds to introduce the very voluntary labeling proposal that Senator Tester had avoided last spring because it did not require anyone to label anything. It is a voluntary labeling initiative that falls well short of what America's cattle producers need so they can begin competing in their own market. So now we have a spoiler that was introduced just before Senator Tester's resolution. The purpose of this is to create confusion by leading cattle producers to believe that this voluntary measure is a restoration of COOL. Nothing could be further from the truth. This voluntary labeling proposal should be rejected by U.S. cattle producers who should agree to nothing less than mandatory COOL for beef, which they desperately need so they can compete. We urge everyone listening to contact your entire congressional delegation to urge them to support Senator Tester's COOL resolution that calls on the entire Senate to reinstate COOL for beef. We also urge everyone to inform their congressional members that the Thune-Rounds bill is not COOL. It is fake COOL and should be withdrawn so we can all get to work to reinstate real COOL, mandatory COOL, and we should accept nothing less. If you wish to help, please go to our website at r-calfusa.com to join in this critical fight. Thank you and goodbye.